Well, hello everyone. It is a pleasure as always to be joined by Matt. You may have known him as Matt of 60 Second Philosophy. You may also have known him as Matt, author of We Are Icarus and the philosophy channel that he has, the philosophy presentations that are still up there, but then also authorship, sharing different ideas here. Matt, really great to be with you. Whenever there is something study in an episode that goes to Plato in any sense, I know exactly who the guy is that I want to call to get on a podcast for it. So thank you as always for that. And of course, if you haven't seen the latest episode yet, this is going to be a follow up to the episode of the Mythos and Logos podcast that had just been posted on the Oracle at Delphi, exploring some of her prophecies, starting in the most ancient mythical times, going to folks like Lycurgus, the legendary founder of Sparta, going all the way to Socrates, and using that as kind of the connection into the modern world, which is a bit more where I would like to get with this. So, thank you very much, Matt, for joining. I do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
So, just as a quick overview, the Oracle at Delphi was this figure who, in the ancient Greek world, ancient Mediterranean in general, because very much into Roman times, she had remained a cultural figure. I feel like these days we get a lot of folks who are claiming some type of prophecy. I mean, just yesterday over the radio speaker, they had some local channel going on, and someone was talking about some prophecy or another. And it's like, okay, this is very common these days, but the track record's not always that fantastic. I think we've been through at least two or three ends of the world right now.
No, more than that.
But what is so fascinating about the Oracle, and part of what had kept her as an institution in the ancient world for 1,000 years, is her record. She had admittedly given rather vague prophecies that could be interpreted both ways. Something like going to a king who wanted to invade Persia and saying, if you invade, you'll destroy a great empire. And it ends up being his own great empire that he destroys. So a lot of them have interpretations that were probably a bit less straightforward than folks will give in a lot of the ones today. And yet, through all that, as the Greeks and Persians went to their series of wars, it was her prophecies that led to the last stand of the 300, that led to the Athenians evacuating and being able to defeat the Persians at sea, because it was said that a Zeus would let a wood wall be their last stand, even though their city would be destroyed. Then the generals said, all right, well, we have a lot of ships. That'll be our wood wall. Let's get out of here, meet them at sea. They were outnumbered, but inspired by the courage and maybe a little bit of time that the Spartans had earned them, were able to drive the Persians back. Um, from that point, the Oracle had become this major authority just because she was very much culturally viewed as the mouthpiece of Apollo, having saved his people, the Greeks, because Apollo was a very uniquely Greek, then Greco Roman god. Uh, it was in that context, then we got to later prophecies when she is this pretty much unquestioned authority. Um, and the prophecy she delivered to, of course, our favorite here, Socrates. As we go to Socrates, a couple of the other oracles that we weren't able to get to in the podcast, like her words to Alexander the Great, who was essentially a great grand student of Socrates. Then going to Julian the Apostate, her last oracle to the Roman emperor who tried to bring back paganism after Constantine's reforms. Then we can go into a little bit of the question of how much should we, a few thousand years beyond, and statistically, most listeners here not going to be in Hellenic pagans, how should we approach this in terms of historical or even into a spiritual lens? So, Matt, real thrilled to have you. And Yeah, if you can hear a little bit about Socrates, we went into a couple of Plato's dialogues, but my understanding is this oracle, I mean, Socrates never wrote himself, but it seems like this was something attested not just in Plato, but from some other folks who were around at the time, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of attestation to Socrates as the man, though there are many questions as to how that kind of fleshes out with these different sources and sort of which ones are more mythological, which ones are more the author having an agenda. But it's most people would agree that the historical Socrates is in there somewhere. And that sort of begs the question as to the historicity of some of the more spiritual events, because Socrates' life was certainly fueled by interaction with the spiritual, foundations of his society, the
Mhm.
oracle, and some of the other. We might talk about the daemon, the demon that he had. All of those were sort of really pivotal to his life and what became of his life and how it ended. So the three primary sources we have on Socrates are Plato, which is the most, as far as number of works, the most we learn about Socrates. Then we have Xenophon, who speaks about his apology, his defense after he's accused in the Athenian courts. And we also have Aristophanes, who was actually earlier than both of them. He wrote a play about Socrates that he entered into a competition and didn't win. That's the Clouds. Now, the Clouds does not have any mention of the Oracle, while the other two do. However, the Clouds does sort of back up the claims that are made in the other two, especially the apologies, that people had some trouble with Socrates. Some people didn't like him very much, and the accusations were slightly varied, but they all revolve around the fact that he's doing stuff with the gods. He's making some claims that are sort of different than the status quo in that society. And he's also angering a lot of high profile people. And he's also encouraging the youth. Corrupting the youth is the word they'd say, but I would say encouraging the youth to be, questioners and thinkers.
And that
So
was the
those are
official charge, right? Corrupting the youth that
corrupting the
they had
youth.
given him.
Yep. Yeah, and some kind of blasphemy against the gods was another one of the charges. Yeah.
Right, right. I believe it was they had accused him of atheism, and then he had said, "Well, it's not that I don't believe in them." He very clearly did believe in the gods in at least his own sense, even if that was a bit different from the way that most of classical Athens might have. But do they all agree as to the sources with Xenophon what the prophecy was? Because going from Plato's Apology, which is what we had consulted in our episode, it was that Socrates' friend had gone to the oracle because people would go on pilgrimage all the time. I mean, every 2 years after the Olympics, there were the Delphic Games where folks would get through and essentially have another set of athletic tournaments. So that would bring huge crowds. But we know that it was happening all the time when there were pilgrims because there were wars fought where the Greek city states would get together and uh, defend against if there were a group of whether it's bandits in one case or a city state that didn't want to uh, go by that common agreement that Delphi would be a place of peace for the pilgrims. So we know it was common enough that people were fighting over it, even outside of the games. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I believe it was a friend of Socrates who had gone to the oracle and said, "Who's going to be the wisest person?" And was told it's Socrates. And Socrates wasn't, I know you had done a podcast recently, you had brought it up, and there's the question of someone wanting to give someone a prophecy to give them a sense of self-importance. Oh, you're so destined for such great things. It's going to be incredible. And I can understand why you might take that with some skepticism, especially these days. We love chosen one type narratives in our storytelling. I feel like there's something different when it's your friend who's not here right now and you didn't tell me about is so chosen for such great things. So,
Right.
I mean, tell him if you want to, I guess, but he's the guy who's so wise.
Right. So there's to get to your first question, there is a difference in the prophecies between these two sources. I've got them both here. I can read them both. So for the guy's name is Chaerephon, and Chaerephon, this is the quote. It says, Chaerephon, as you well know, was very impetuous in all his doings. So he's kind of, he's a squirrely guy. And he went to Delphi and boldly asked the oracle to tell him whether, and then he kind of tells the crowd to be quiet because they're sort of interrupting. He asked the oracle to tell him whether there was anyone wiser than I, and the Pythian prophetess answered that there was no man wiser. So, you from this source you get the sense that Chaerephon's kind of trying to be a little bit of a little squirrely, trying to cause trouble because clearly Socrates was already, causing some trouble. And Chaerephon by this time is dead, but Socrates says that his brother, who was there in the courtroom, can attest to that having happened. Now, the Xenophon, and the point of this is that it begins his quest. Socrates then doesn't believe it. The apology is very short. Everyone should just read it. But basically, Socrates says, "I don't believe this," and based on that, he goes around and he starts asking people. He starts basically testing these other wise people, and coming to realize that they don't really know much of what they're talking about. They think they know things, but they don't. So that's the beginning of his quest. Xenophon's apology looks a little different because he doesn't mention much of this quest at all, but his writings are more focused on basically just angering the jurors. So Socrates' main purpose is just to sound really pretentious and really like terrible, maybe not terrible, but just really grating against these jurors. So Socrates in this says, let me tell you something more, so that all of you who feel so inclined may still have greater disbelief in my being honored of heaven. Once at a time, when Chaerephon made the inquiry at the Delphic oracle, so it's still Chaerephon, concerning me, in the presence of many people, Apollo answered that there was no man more free than I, or more just, or more prudent. So prudent, has the connotation of wise, but it doesn't really, it doesn't really go much further than that. It's just like, the oracle says I'm pretty great, and that's it. Now, there is a third source that I like to go to. I don't know if I have it here. Oh, I do have it here. And that's Diogenes. A guy named Diogenes Laertius. I think that's how his name is pronounced.
Different from Diogenes the Cynic, right?
Yes, yes, way later. So Diogenes the Cynic was, Hellenistic, around the time of Socrates, and there's a famous interaction between him and Alexander the Great, Diogenes the Cynic. But no, this guy wrote a book called The Lives of the Great Philosophers, and he's written, I believe, in the ADs 100, 200, 300, something like that. And so he basically tried to compile the history and biography of the Greek philosophers. And the reason I really like him is because obviously he's way closer to these events. So he probably had sources that we don't have anymore that he was kind of utilizing. And he also has a really good list of the Platonic dialogues,
Mm-hmm.
some of which are now contested. But the funny thing about that is the more people study, the more they think that his list is pretty solid. So Diogenes, his account matches much more closely to Plato's account in the Apology than Xenophon's.
Okay. And the prophecy itself was either, so we definitely have from the sources they agree it was not given to Socrates, it was given to
Right.
Chaerephon.
Mm-hmm.
And the question was either, is there anybody wiser than him? In which case the answer is no. And
Right.
or he was the most free, just, and prudent. So either way, very high praise for Socrates, who we can tell from you had mentioned um, Aristophanes in the clouds, who was kind of this satirical look at Socrates. I remember we had um, to to use this slightly vulgar translation that I had read in college for it. I remember Socrates was looking up at the sky, and what did he see? Oh, he saw a bird shit on his head. Uh, and so that gives you a bit of an idea for the irreverence, so to say, Aristophanes had in his humor, but he doesn't actually mention this. So then there's a question of whether, well, maybe it's something that only the sources that really were more sympathetic to Socrates looked more into the claim or saw it as starting his mission. But in either case, Aristophanes does have the same, even in his criticism, incessant questioning that Socrates had. The way he
Yeah.
referred to himself as a gadfly biting on the great horse that is Athens to keep it going, as though he would just go up to anybody and start asking them questions. Well, why do you believe that? Oh, you think this? Interesting. Oh, why? Well, what about that? You know, if you think this and you think this, then what do you think that? And just going with it to the point where people would accuse him of using this method to be able to trying to find the right word.
There's an exact phrase that they use. It's making the lesser point greater, or making the lesser stance greater. So basically, he's taking this poor argument and making it appear to be the better argument.
Right, just through his rhetoric. It's almost like the sophistry that he was very much opposed to, but the sophists who were essentially just eloquent arguers. It seems like in the sources we have that are more sympathetic to him, Socrates viewed himself as kind of taking on a very much divine, like you had mentioned, role. And that's where you had mentioned the daimon demon is a translation, but it's less like evil red guy poking you with a stick or
Right.
torturing you. Daimon to the Greeks meant more like a spirit, right? Like a guardian angel, as we might call them, could be a daimon too, right?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. The word is very non, um, or not necessarily, malicious or malevolent or anything like that. And the interesting thing about that is he also mentions that in the Apology of Plato, he mentions his daimon, as well as in the Phaedrus, as well as this is a source I actually, when I was looking at this yesterday, I just found Alcibiades one, which
Oh,
which is a dialogue that was sort of disputed in the Platonic canon, but is now making its way back into vogue. Um, Interestingly, that source specifically equates the daimon, the demon, to the god Apollo, probably, which is interesting because none of the other sources do that.
interesting. My understanding is that the daimon, the spirit, essentially had a voice that would tell him when he was doing something wrong or doing
Yeah, it
something
was
that he
always
shouldn't.
prohibiting. Yeah, it was never encouraging, always prohibiting.
Never
So,
told him what to do, just told him what's not right. And during his whole defense, it was silent, which seemed a bit unusual unless he was, well, not doing anything that his internal spirituality was telling him not to. I've seen
yeah.
some. There's this one great piece of art, and while I edit, I'll put it on the screen. It's Socrates speaking with someone, and you can actually see an illustration of like the guardian angel or diamond figure on his shoulder, as though it's kind of telling him,
Yeah, well, famously, in the Apology, well, I say famously, and now I'm not even sure if it's in here, but I'm pretty sure it's in here, somewhere in here. Um, he mentions that when he sat down to prepare his defense, that's when the demon or the diamond told him, "Don't do it, don't prepare anything." So
huh,
that was the prohibition.
That is fascinating. And of course the defense it it seems like it had some, and I think it gives you a little bit of an insight into the kind of person Socrates was, in that it would have at least garnered some sympathy to not have them sentence him to death, which was an original potential sentence, because the trials were broken up into two: one, innocent or guilty, and then two, what's going to be the punishment. When being asked for the punishment, it seems like the Athenian establishment had essentially wanted him to just go somewhere else, be somebody else's problem. You're old now, just do it somewhere else. Socrates said, "No way, I'm an Athenian." He had been a soldier. He had fought in the Greco-Persian Wars, I think. Um, Certainly in some wars. I think one of the Greco-Persian ones, but not certain on that. But he had been an Athenian soldier. He had fought for his city, and he had been a patriot of his city, loved his city, and yet um, he didn't want to leave, so they let him select an alternate punishment. And he said, "You should punish me by putting me up for free, giving me free meals, giving me the
Yeah.
treatment you give the Olympian gold medal winners, essentially, to put it in a modern Olympian kind of term. Put me in the highest regard. I'll be in the middle of the city. Everyone can come to me." And then in
It
a
didn't work out. Yeah.
far worse than he had actually been. Uh, it was very narrow in terms of the guilty finding, and then when he had proposed that, they were like, "Okay, kill this guy." Um, but all of that getting to, though, back to the oracle and the role of influence, though, Socrates was very fine facing that death. I know he had said in the apology and in some of the dialogues right afterwards, chronologically or biographically, I should say, uh, that, well, why should he fear death? He's been here, and death is either going to be, maybe he goes to the Elysian fields and he's in a paradise and everything is wonderful. And maybe it's just the most restful sleep he's had in his life. But knowing the gods as much as he does in the way that he does, it's not going to be some unjust place of torture for someone who's being good and trying their best and being earnest. And the idea that people fearing what's next could be just so far off. Really beautiful in terms of
Hmm.
his lack of fear for it. Really, really beautiful attestation. But then to go to the oracle more, of course, the prophecy does kind of fulfill itself. He is the wisest man, and at least in the fact that if you like Western philosophy at all, it's because of him. And maybe who's before Socrates? You've got Pythagoras, and his teacher was an oracle. The woman who taught Pythagoras what he gave credit for uh, was was serving as the oracle at Delphi for a time. Then Socrates had taught Plato, who was probably a little bit more sure about things than Socrates ever was in terms of making um, authoritative statements, but also wrote things down. So it gives him a bit more of a
Yeah.
lasting legacy in the very text-based written culture we have. Uh, Plato, of course, taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, and then Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world to him at
Right.
the
Yeah.
time and spread that culture all around and became, well, I think it's really difficult to overemphasize, just because of how much there is, just how important Socrates was to
Right.
the
Right.
culture we
I
have
don't think
now.
you. I don't think you can overemphasize it. And I mean, even just in the realm of philosophy, you mentioned those. That sort of that chain of people, which is true. And if you think about how you know the Platonists, the Neoplatonists affected Christianity. That's one thing. If you think about how Aristotle affected the medievals and the Enlightenment and all that, like it's incredible. And then even in the more uh, closer to the epicenter, you have the Hellenistic schools, which all have their root in Socrates. Um, so the Stoics and the Epicureans and the Cynics, skeptics. So I mean, it's and then like you said, politically, the way that the world. I mean, the reason the world speaks Greek, right? The reason that we have, if you're talking about Christianity, aside from theology, like the reason we have a Greek New Testament is because of that chain of events. Because that's why the world spoke Greek at the time. Like that was the written language. So yeah, you can't overemphasize it. I mean, that's
And then the chain of ideas too. We had gone in. There was a brief little blurb in the episode, but when you just get to Aristotle, who's essentially two generations of teaching removed from Socrates, then Aristotle, his his systems he came up with, I mean, are so foundational to a lot of what we have that they're applied to so much. I mean, the basics of science are there, not the modern scientific method as we have, but then also you look at theology. I mean, Thomas Aquinas, who anything in Catholic theology you can trace to Aquinas, and that is something that he was starting with Aristotle as his base. You look at things like poetry, literature, Dante, you have Aristotle at his base. I mean, politically too. I'm sure there are others, but if you look at like objectivism, which is a super basically radical capitalist reading of Aristotle, you've got. I mean, there's just so much that is based on these ideas of tracing a chain of events back to its source, right?
yeah,
Or
back to
finding
one sentence spoken in a on a hill. It's like
yes,
it's crazy. It's insane.
and there's even a bit of the trace to it makes sense it was so easily applied to Christianity and Islam as well. I mean, the Arab scholars of the Middle Ages were freaking, and not just Arab, Spain too. I mean, absolutely, absolutely so well versed in all of the Greek classics too. Um, and part of that is Aristotle taught Alexander, who has one of the most revealing prophecies of the oracle in terms of the kind of guy that Alexander was, where he conquered the world just through essentially brute force. I mean, I don't think until maybe Genghis Khan do you get somebody with the
Mm.
same devotion to you're going to join me or you're going to die, as well as the success with it. Obviously, Alexander and Genghis Khan probably both had folks that didn't like him very much. Yet Alexander, there's one famous story of the Gordian knot where there was this incredibly complex knot of rope, and it was said whoever could unweave it or untie or undo the knot would be able to rule the world. The idea showing that it's how difficult leadership is because there are all of these things intertwined, complex, everything leans on another. Alexander takes a sword and cuts it in half and says, done. Um, but the oracle prophecy, he before he goes out conquering, as folks do, since the really when you go back to the Spartans and the more mythic accounts, as folks do, before you're going to start a war, you consult the oracle to see how you're going to do. And she told Alexander, "Come back later." And so Alexander grabbed her by the hair, dragged her out of the sanctuary, and took his sword and said, "No, give me the prophecy now." She went, all right, you're invincible." I mean, and then of course Alexander does die young. Maybe it's a disease. Maybe it's because a lot of his generals, by the time they've gotten to India, and he still wants to keep going, and they say, "Dude, can we just go home?" I know we don't know exactly how Alexander did die, but there's definitely, well, a lot of folks he made unhappy, right? Yet the it's still this fascinating idea in terms of this chain of ideas, this chain of people, and yet she's still here in the center of it. Oracle, I mean, was very much in the way that folks might go on a pilgrimage to the Vatican today. You would go to a pilgrimage to Delphi then. Um, and it's interesting because as the world had begun to change, I mean, she even appears in the Bible.
Mm.
In the Acts of the Apostles, Paul is at one point, there's a woman with, depending on the translation, it says there's a spirit in her. If you look at it in,
Yeah, it comes out as like evil spirit, but it's actually like a python spirit, a spirit of python, right?
yes, and the python is the creature that Apollo had slain at Delphi. So the python is kind of this gigantic, chaotic, like primordial giant snake of chaos. And Apollo, who's the god of order in the way that he's medicine, he's music, he's reason. Apollo was able to slay the chaos, and in honor of that, the Homeric hymn to Apollo, which is the oldest that I know of source that talks about the oracle, says that's why the oracle was created in commemoration of Apollo's slaying of the python. So when we hear a spirit of python, like, if you don't know that, it sounds like, oh, evil snake spirit in this lady. But
Right.
if you go to the Greek, what's the spirit of Python? That's the Pythia. What is Pythia? That's what the Greeks called the oracle. So whether or not she's the oracle, because there were others, just Delphi was the one who, because of her track record, was the most respected.
Hmm.
There's still a prophetess in that tradition who appears in the Bible, and then she's making the well, let me pull up the actual passage from Acts.
Yeah, I mean, as you do that, it's also really interesting to consider for any any Christians that are listening. Um, the Bible seems to be in some way acknowledging the existence of this spirit. It's not saying, oh, like this person was pretending to have a spirit, or this person had a demon, which was also, like a demon in the Christian sense, which
Mhm.
was also the spirit. Like it seems to sort of acknowledge that this is a thing.
Yeah, because evil spirit, I when I get to what she says, and this is, I'll read the New International Version. An evil spirit wouldn't say, starting in Acts 16:16. Once we were going to the place, and this is Paul writing, once when we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted for the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune telling. And she followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who are telling you the way to be saved." She kept this up for many days. And it's so we have this
And eventually
appeal.
they get annoyed, right? They just get annoyed, right? By the
Exactly. Finally, Paul became so annoyed, he turns around and says to the spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." And then the spirits leave. Her owners say, "Oh no, we don't have our own little oracle here anymore. So let's take Paul and Silas and drag them to prison." They say these men are Jews and throwing the city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice. Of course, Paul gets out of it, as he did, by saying, "Dude, I'm a Roman citizen. So who
right,
are you to be arresting me right now by your town's uh, procedures over
right,
not getting money from your fortune teller anymore?" But yeah, there's very much is biblically an acknowledgement of whatever's in her being something.
right.
And if we actually go to and this one's contested just because it's from a later time. But uh, if we go 300s AD, so this is after Constantine's reforms, Christianity's legal, becoming the de facto religion of Rome, and there is the fellow Julian the Apostate, the last pagan emperor, where he tried to outlaw Christianity, began some persecutions, and in and these are later explicitly Christian sources, so not from Julian himself, which is why it is a bit contested. But in either way, it's where the narrative of the myth and the shared story goes. And I think regardless of debatable historicity, that is something important. That he sends a messenger to visit the oracle at Delphi, and her temple is nowhere near what it used to be. And the last prophecy, or one of the last, is tell the emperor that my hall has fallen to the ground. Phoebus, which is a name for Apollo, no longer has his house, nor his mantic bay, nor his prophetic spring. The water has dried up.
And do you have the date or a general date of the earliest sort of reference to the Delphic Oracle?
So earliest in the mythological, it goes to probably roughly 700s BC. Um, when we're talking about things to Lycurgus, in terms of the actual first historic reference, that would be Homeric hymn to Apollo. Let me check when that would have been from. Essentially, right around 7th century BC, so before the classical Hellenic time we
Yeah.
think
So
of
so
with
you
Greek.
said around 1,000 years. And I mean that matches. I mean, so this thing was chugging along for 1,000 years.
Yeah, just about. And then once the it's interesting because there's a trope in a lot of modern sort of urban mythology fiction that uh that essentially the gods powers are based on how many people believe in them to a sense. And it's interesting that when Greeks the Greek Hellenic paganism is falling out of fashion in Rome and Christianity is becoming first tolerated and then made official, that it ends up being the same time that the oracle loses the spring. They say the spring because there was an actual um, cracks in the ground essentially where it was said fumes would come up. Some folks have said, well, maybe there was a gas leak. Who knows? Debated. Regardless, it's more the tradition that interests me, and it's that there was something tied to the place that then just wasn't there anymore.
Mm.
Also, this was around the time that when Julian the Apostate was persecuting the Christians, as happens when people get persecuted but are starting to become a majority and come into power, Christians did some counter persecutions against the pagans, and it happened. That also means that part of why it's ruins now is, yeah, the central institution of this, being the oracle, is of course going to be a target in that. Yet, in that Christian tradition, again, she's even today, we can see and far past that time reverence for the oracle. There was one piece of art, again, I'll put it up on the screen here, was from the Sistine Chapel. That when you think of the Christian church, most people are thinking of the Sistine Chapel as the one to go. It is an awe-inspiring, incredible place, and one of the first Delphic oracles is on the wall.
Mm.
A lot of the Renaissance too was so sympathetic to this, and even today, in my understanding, there's a bit of a context we can view it in. You were mentioning a theologian, evangelical, Michael S. Heiser, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not super well acquainted. I read one of his books and I've seen a couple of his things, but it really got me thinking in this context because he has this kind of interesting perspective on sort of the gods of the nations, and that sort of thing. His idea is something called divine council theology, and the idea is that a lot of times in the Bible, when God says, you know, we, or when God is talking about sort of his, what's the word? His heavenly
Heavenly
host.
host,
Yeah.
right? The Elohim.
Yeah, that's right. That's talking about basically like, you know, these sort of hierarchies of divine creatures. So, you know, God created likely more than just what we see, right? We have understanding that there's at least angels and other things like that, but that he created other, we'll use the word divine beings that are, you know, subservient to him, but still to us pretty serious, pretty big deal sort of thing.
Mm,
And he uses, there are many passages he goes to, but the one that I thought was just most interesting was he uses the passage of the Tower of Babel,
mm,
where God separates the people by language. In a parallel passage, it says he separated them according to the number of gods.
mm.
So the implication there is that God gave up the nations. And he said, "You guys are now under these various divine beings, these various other Elohim." And so the gods of the nations are actually beings that exist, that have power, that are able to do things. And the ultimate story of the Bible is sort of reconciling those people, and I guess also those gods to, you know, God's big picture plan of the cosmos. You know,
Mm,
so
mm.
what that the implications for that is that in scenarios where there are uh, you know, clearly tested national deities, national gods, we might want to consider looking at those as uh, you know, as legitimate happenings, you know, as actual spiritual interactions with the physical world. I mean, in the Bible, we see in Exodus, you know, the magicians are doing some weird stuff. You know, like
Right.
Moses is coming along with his miracles, or and the magician's like, oh, we can do that up to a certain point. They are able to do it, and depending on how you would read that passage, you'd say, okay, well, there's a force that that is sort of allowing that to happen, is sort of creating that situation.
Right. If you've got Elijah on one side and a priest of Baal on the other, and they're having a fire making contest with their prayers, like it is kind of a question that for a monotheist, how you how you answer the idea that, well, who's who's the other guy praying to, and
Well, not only that, but like you have to think about it from their perspective. Like in that account, they're they seem to be expecting fire. You know what I mean? Like
yes,
if that's never happened before, they probably wouldn't be acting that way. You know, but I mean, it seems like that was within the realm of possibilities for them, which is why they accepted the challenge.
there's like a I don't mean it to sound diminishing. There's like an internet atheist kind of talking point where it's like, yeah, I'll tell you all the reasons I don't believe in your God when you tell me why you don't believe in Thor and Zeus and Apollo and so on and so on.
Right,
The idea
right.
being that, well, it's if you're picking one out of thousands, then why that one? And it's interesting that I don't think most people realize that in the Christian tradition, at least, that question is addressed. I mean, there's even a. It's interesting is when I was doing a little bit of research into him. I don't know nearly as much as I haven't read the book, but apparently Heiser even had his own podcast. But when you had mentioned that, I thought of the Lord of Spirits podcast. It's two or Eastern Orthodox priests, Fathers Stephen DeYoung and Andrew Stephen Domick, and they go into the same thing. Who are the different spirits? Kind of the hierarchy of the heavenly host. They had an episode in a couple years ago in 2022, the gods of the nations. When ancient Israel encountered pagan nations worshiping their gods and sometimes joined in it themselves, because right,
Mm.
the Solomon had a lot of other deities in the temple. What were they worshiping? Are they fallen angels or demons, ancestors, spirits of humans, or nothing at all? And how did the church understand the worship? Then, of course, going from that point, they go into uh, idolatry and different views. But what I think is very interesting, if you are inclined to the angelology sense of cosmic things, which, if you're not, I get it. Oracle's number one thing is know yourself. And Socrates said, hey, if I don't know myself yet, how am I going to be taking guesses on what's going on in the beyond? Let me just accept whatever it is they believe. That is the common thing because I'll take it. I'm going to worry about me. If you do want to expand upon it though, because people have taken the know thyself, which was the maxim of the oracle of Delphi, in the context of what's around you, then it's just very interesting in terms of how much weight or how seriously to take the well, all of the things that certainly have the folks who back them up yet, and the tradition, yet don't necessarily fit neatly into one's own model.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think just, you're kind of talking about like the infinite atheists and that sort of thing. Like, I think there's a cultural push to sort of see everything in a very materialistic or naturalistic sense. And, there's this like dichotomy between, strict fundamentalist Christianity and, materialistic nihilism, basically.
Mhm.
And I think even just looking at the non Christian world historically, I think there's some reason to believe that there have been supernatural events that occurred, just like basically. Um, and so then like the question sort of boils down to like, you know, like you said, how do we fit that into our understanding of the world? And I think the best way to start, in my opinion, is to simply acknowledge that those sorts of things are possible and kind of see where it takes you. You know,
Mm.
I don't I don't know. I mean, I definitely have the foundation of Christianity. Like I believe that, but once you get into this sort of amorphous realm of spirituality that's sort of going on in the off stage, if you would, it raises a lot of interesting questions.
Right. With this project, Mythos and Logos, the idea for me has always been finding the harmonies in that you don't need to necessarily subscribe to a system to be able to find something worthwhile at the very least. At the very least. And if you can really learn about historical people, living people, historical belief systems, living belief systems, get a picture of the broad context, and then to draw it back to knowing yourself to find where you find yourself fitting in that context. It's an election year, and I'm not endorsing anybody on a podcast. But Kamala Harris once said, "What do you think? You fell out of a coconut tree? No, you're a product of everything around you, right?
Hmm.
The idea of like a dependent origination that you didn't just poof out of nowhere, but you're living in a culture that was shaped by. I mean, if you're in the West listening to this, like you and I are, then you're living in a culture that was shaped by the Oracle and by supernatural claims of a guy, Socrates, who through the, whether you want to say voice in his head, whether you want to say guardian angel, whether you want to say God Apollo speaking to him, he took this very seriously, and the product is everything we have now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a definite case for, regardless of where things fit in your own system, that just taking other people's experience seriously will very much be something that, if you're a Christian, can help make you a better Christian. If you're a Muslim, can help make you a better Muslim. If you're a Buddhist, can help make you a better Buddhist. If you're an atheist humanist, can help make you a better atheist humanist, and so on and so on. There's a very long list.
Yeah, there's a really good book. I've probably mentioned it before. A guy named Leon Cass. He's at the University of Chicago. I don't know if he's still there. He's super old. He wrote a book on Genesis called The Beginning of Wisdom.
Hmm.
And it's one of my favorite books. In fact, I've got it right here. I'll just show you. Yeah, he does a lot of stuff on bioethics and stuff, but he got really into Genesis, and he has a book on Exodus as well. Fantastic. I mean, one of my favorite books. Anyway, um, the point I was going to make is that he has this really interesting comment on the book of Genesis that I think applies to your subject of mythology, and anytime you're looking at a perennial work of literature, that Genesis isn't necessarily what happened. There's lots of debate about the historicity of those texts, but what always happens.
Hmm.
And I think that's the point. That's why we read these things, is because it's telling us not necessarily what happened, but it's telling us what's going to happen every single time. It's telling us these sort of motifs in the human experience that we can rely on, and that we can sort of glean from, no matter where we are, what context we're in.
Right, laying down the pattern. The very first episode we did. So this is, if you've made it almost an hour into this, congratulations, you're getting some biography. This podcast started when I was called for jury duty.
Huh.
And I had been debating doing something like this for a while. I took a notebook and I just started writing. And I thought, well, I've been thinking about doing something with mythology. So where should I start? How about creation myths? Which one? How about Genesis? And the very first episode we had done was taking Genesis 1. You get the order of creation, 7 days, let there be light, and so on. And it gets increasingly complex. You get the light, you get the divisions, the firmaments, the waters, separation of them. You get the land coming up from them. You get the fish and birds, so they're in the waters. Then you get the land creatures, the cattle and the creeping things. Then you get man, and then you get a break. But there it presents it going in an increasing complexity. And then Genesis chapter 2, right after having the animals created and then the man, says, so in the beginning, when man was created and there weren't any animals
Yeah,
yet.
right.
So clearly there's a, that's where I took it as, okay, let's take these as something beyond a literal read and make it into, what can this tell us symbolically. And if you still want to do something literal, sure, like, do you, man. I think, though, having the symbolic, that understanding for, like you had said, that Cass says, what always happens, is going to be so much more depth to it. um,
Right.
Now, I do need to close out on this. So, do you have any final thoughts for everybody who has made it this far?
I mean, any of the things that we talked about really are just great on ramps to a lot of the big ideas. I mean, if you did the biography of Socrates, if you read the Apology, or the the four works that are sort of associated with his final days, if you read Genesis, if you did a biography on Alexander the Great, like any of these things are really on ramps to a really, like, just incredible time in history. And it's worth reading. It's worth getting into those primary sources. I think that era really helps me to understand kind of how everything happened the way it happened, sets the stage for a lot of really big events. So I just recommend getting into the primary sources. There's no substitute for it. And as far as that goes, they're pretty accessible.
Matt, super a pleasure as always. Thank you very much, and wishing you all the best.
Thanks. You too. We'll do it again soon.
You know it. Cheers.